following is the second joint side events by CO-OP4CBD, BioAgora, RESPIN and Biodiversa Plus at UNCBD's COP16 in Cali, Columbia.
And to start, what are SPI? If we consider IPBES definition, environment-related SPI are organizations, initiatives, or projects that work at the boundary of science, policy, and society to enrich decision-making, shape their participants' and audiences' understandings of problems, and so produce outcomes regarding decisions and behaviors. In order to do so, however, a proactive articulation of policy needs regarding scientific information is crucial, as well as the time and resources to dedicate for the interaction in science-policy interface. This will provide the basis for the knowledge holder to again refine and target the research. It is very important to underline that this interface is absolutely working both sides. It is not a one-way road, but a co-construction mechanism. And I would say this is maybe the importance of this project. After IPBES and IPCC being SPI, these are the new kind of SPI that are supporting their activities. If each of our projects intervene specifically into this framework and take place in different spots in this global ecosystem made of knowledge holders in biodiversity or climate, and then IPBES and IPCC, and then UNFCCC, CBD, if each of our projects intervene specifically into this framework and take place in different spots in this global ecosystem made of knowledge holders in biodiversity or climate, and then IPBES and IPCC, and then UNFCCC, CBD, and European Commission. So you can see where like, for example, COP4CBD is situated at the interface between knowledge holder in biodiversity and CBD. RESPIN is at the interface between knowledge holder and IPBES and IPCC. BioAgora makes the link with the needs of the European Union, and Biodiversa could be put a little everywhere, but in particular in the consolidation of the knowledge holder community. Okay, COP4CBD stands for Cooperation for the CBD that has begun 2 years ago. And maybe I will share our activities, as maybe the goals are already, like, I guess, somehow clear. So among our activities, there is expert and negotiator dialogues. There is training on the use of the clearinghouse mechanism in Bioland. There is training on technical and scientific cooperation on CBD processes. And there is production of technical briefs and outreach activities to promote engagement and involvement in the CBD. So if COP4CBD is aimed at CBD, RESPIN project is mostly aimed at other SPI, IPBES, and IPCC. You can see it down there. RESPIN is a new project which started earlier this year with the mission to strengthen synergies, policy support, and knowledge uptake of IPBES and IPCC. A lot has been done in this topic, and first steps are to analyze the experience with support and capacity building for IPBES and IPCC processes. Among activities, there is empowering knowledge holder and to create a network of IPBES and IPCC focal points in Europe and Central Asia, and also to support the creation of similar network in Latin America and Central Africa. There is also identifying processes and enabling conditions to improve the knowledge uptake. Also strengthening uptake in the science service mechanism as supported by BioAgora, producing webinars and policy briefs as an upscaling measure, and also to form strategic partnership to ensure diffusion of output projects. We mentioned BioAgora. As we could say before, formulating adequate responses to pressing challenges at the science policy interface requires effective and legitimate knowledge brokering. The overarching goal of BioAgora is the development of a fair and functional science service for biodiversity, which will facilitate the orchestration of processes and initiative at the SPI at the European level. The Science Service for Biodiversity has three overarching functions. One, transforming the processes with and between science and policy. Two, creating and supporting active thematic networks. And at the very core, the answering request function with the subsequent evidence-based building. To answer policy requests, BioAgora is testing different knowledge brokering mechanisms, and currently the prototype of a knowledge brokering mechanism tailored to EU-funded community. Here you see the schematic overview of the mechanism. We don't have time to get into details, but this mechanism will allow for a tailored response to policy requesters within weeks or months on urgent policy relevant issues. And to finish this presentation, Biodiversa, it is the European COP-funded biodiversity partnership supporting excellent research on biodiversity with an impact for policy and society. It is part of the European Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, and it connects science, policy, and practice towards transformative change for the sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity. It currently gathers 83 research programmers and funders and environmental policy actors from 41 European and associated countries to work on 5 main objectives, as you can see in the picture.
Thank you very much, Constance. Now I would like to invite our panelists to the front stage. First, we have Connor Kretsch from the CO-OP Initiative and the Selina Project. Then we have Hugo Montilla-Meluk from OLAP. And we have Francesca Vitali from the Smithsonian Institution and the Global Health Program and the IUCN Conservation Initiative. Thank you very much for joining us today. Connor, I would like to start with you. We heard now about the different projects and the role of SPIs, and we are very much aware how health and biodiversity are linked. But how can we link this better, and how can we communicate better the links between biodiversity and health, and how would you define the role of the SPIs?
Thank you. Is that better? That is better. I guess, I mean, SPIs, that we've seen some great examples in the slides that were just presented of how, particularly from the perspective of the projects that have been listed, how SPIs can function and how they can be kind of put into a specific framework that might work very well for key messages. Whether it's biodiversity and health, or biodiversity and climate change, or biodiversity, climate change and health, and other nexuses. What we found at the COHAB initiative, which is cooperation on health and biodiversity, is that, well, obviously there's so many different ways that science policy interfaces might work, and they often have to be culturally sensitive, or they might be locally dependent on particular political institution frameworks, or the ways in which different organizations have been operating traditionally. But before you even get to the stage of perhaps identifying the priorities, and I think looking at that slide, I noticed, there's 3 kind of standard parts to an SPI, no matter what form they take. It's identifying what your priorities are, what you're going to work together on. The second is really gathering the evidence, either existing evidence or funding research, particularly that kind of co-collaborative research that you need to put together. To address the key priorities. And then there's the ways of communicating it and developing responses. And the communication and the response development are often go hand in hand, because you need to convince people to come on board with the responses. The difficulty occurs before you even get to the identifying the priority stage, particularly when it comes to biodiversity and health, because the community that works on biodiversity often speaks a very different language to the community that works on health, particularly human health or public health. So there's a different technical language. There's different scales of operation. The health sector is often very much focused on immediate responses to critical or acute issues. Whereas biodiversity tends to be, when we're talking about for particularly nature restoration and using nature-based solutions for health, you're talking about a much longer scale of operation. So if you are talking about preventing the next pandemic or improving mental health by investing in forest restoration or in urban green space, you're talking about 5 to 10 years to multiple decades before you really get to see the results. The health sector will expect to see randomized control trials and other forms of evidence that are very different from the forms of evidence that the ecology or nature conservation sector might provide. So that barrier has to be overcome first. And there's many other barriers that exist in terms of not just standards of evidence, but the way that evidence is communicated and the way that, in the European Union, we'd be very familiar with the precautionary principle, but the way the precautionary principle is initiated for the health sector is really, it's a very different bar to the level that would be set for the nature conservation community. So in order to really get that first part started, to start identifying priorities, you need to be on the same page. The health sector needs to understand how biodiversity is of relevance to their priorities, and vice versa. The biodiversity community needs to understand how the priorities of the health sector can potentially fit into their own narratives. So the way we do it at COHAB, and it's part of this project that we're working on, another EU project separate to this, but to the 4 that you've heard about so far today, but hopefully we'll be making links to reach out and to share more information. This project is called Selena, and it's really looking at the science of ecosystem services and natural capital and trying to turn it into effective policy options and policy guidance. We're adding the health dimension into this. And one of the ways we look at it is to try and create a narrative that will work for all of the different constituents that we need to speak to. So when you're speaking about biodiversity and health, really, it's not just the nature conservation community and the health sector you need to speak with. You also need to include people involved in forestry and fisheries and tourism, in land use planning and economics and finance and public protection or social protection. So you need to understand where all of their different perspectives come in. Increasingly, we're hearing that we need to not only listen to the lessons from Indigenous and local communities, but to actually let them speak their stories themselves in these fora, not just for people to collect the evidence and present it. So what we do is to try and create a narrative that can bring all of these different people together. So if you imagine a conference that's scientists only, scientists like to present their data and talk about their projects. If a conference was just policymakers only, they have a particular way of presenting things. We've all seen UN language here, and we know what that's like. Likewise, if you have Indigenous and local communities, they have a particular story that they want to tell. And then you've got businesses and you've got academics of another kind and young people and so on. So the key is to create a narrative that will bring everybody to the table together. I'm going to pass the microphone on and not use up too much time, but you get an idea of just how incredibly complex this is. And maybe we'll hear some, I know, Hugo has potentially some stories here from Columbia and how they address some of these issues. But the key thing is bringing people to the table that they can all agree on a central point. Very often it's just maximizing human health and protecting human health. That's often enough to get people to the table. And then it's about kind of sharing experiences, sharing knowledge, learning from each other, and taking it forward to the next step. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Connor. Next, I would like to give the floor to Francesca, because we heard about different sectors, and you come from the wildlife sector. So what do we need to do? And what is the role for wildlife? What do you foresee for preventing the next pandemic, for example?
Thank you, Jute. Yes, I would like to. I'm a wildlife veterinarian and researcher, and I'm based in Kenya, although I'm from Europe, Italy. And there is an important link between wildlife health and One Health, but this is often overlooked in the One Health arena. And actually, there is a bit of misunderstanding about wildlife health in One Health. Most of the times, we talk about preventing the next pandemic, but that's not all. And I would like to talk about the other aspect. Wildlife health, and especially healthy wildlife populations, are fundamental for a healthy ecosystem and healthy planet. They have fundamental ecosystem services. So since I live in Kenya, I'll talk about African elephants, for example. They are ecosystem engineers. And there is a study of a few years ago from Nature that actually quantify how much elephants, by selecting which plants, how much they can help storing carbon. And yeah, this is quite impressive to be able to give a number. But also on the other side, healthy ecosystems are important for wildlife health. And if we don't have healthy ecosystems, we affect the health of wildlife, and in turn the One Health. As an example, with habitat fragmentation, what happens is that the contact between wildlife increases, between wildlife species, but also wildlife species with livestock and with humans. So this affects the whole system. So affects conservation, affects the community, since we were talking about communities, and affects livestock. And communities rely on livestock, so everything is connected. And another important topic that I think is very often forgotten is that wildlife health is not only important for human health and for preventing the next pandemic and the ecosystem balance, so in turns humans again, but also for conservation. So there are species that are on the brinks of extinction because of diseases. For example, African wild dogs, because of distemper from dogs, they almost got extinct. And now with vaccination campaigns and several campaigns, we are managing to rescue the situation. But yeah, so I think the wildlife health is a broad topic that needs that needs holistic approach and needs to be integrated broadly with one health agenda, but also restoration agenda and conservation agenda. And I can come back to this later, but I work in translocations and restoration, and this is an example on how everything is linked. Pass the word to Hugo.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Hugo, now that we heard about the SPI, about a different sector, now let's talk barriers. What would, in your opinion, be the greatest barriers we have to battle when it comes to biodiversity and health?
Thank you, Ute, for the invitation, and thank you for the great introduction to the most difficult subject, which is barriers. But am I custom? Hello? Now, yeah, okay. Well, I think that the greatest barrier is philosophical. And it's because we do not, I don't think that we do fully understand what One Health is. And it makes difficult the implementation. I'm a professor. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. They told me that there's a little bit of more of time, so I'm going to take full advantage of this. The first thing is trying to understand what are the origins of the concept. And at least to my knowledge, we have like 3 different branches. So the oldest branches comes from the Grinnellian philosophy of Nietzsche. It's the Grinnellian approach that we call the environmental surveillance. And it was an issue of the biologists like me. I'm the great-great-son of Grinnell. This is my school. And Grinnell did something really wonderful. The ones who doesn't know Grinnell, he was the curator of the vertebrate zoology department at UC in Berkeley. And also he was the one who coined the term mammalogy and ornithology. He is considered the father of these 2 big disciplines, and also museology. And he started collecting data in a very rigorous way, and with the idea that this data will save us at some point from something difficult. Unusual behavior of nature is what he told us. And it was more than 100 years ago. We missed this piece of information that probably would help us to save some money and lives, which is the most important thing here. All sorts of life, not only human life. So this is the first main branch, the oldest one, the health surveillance, the environmental surveillance. It was a biology thing. So it was in the base basic science. And then we have the primary prevention, which is the medical branch. And they were trying to understand from where the diseases come from. What was the origin of these diseases? And they were trying to stop these diseases at the origin. Carlos Finlay in Cuba, yellow fever, all these kind of things, Rockefeller Foundation, these big issues. The Flexnerian medicine that joins biology to medicine, medical schools. If you want to become a physician, you have to pass through the painful process of being first a biologist, and then you get into the medical school. That was the second big branch. And the third branch, that is the newer one, is the one of the veterinarians. And at the beginning, they were actually claiming for a more balanced situation between physicians, doctors that work with humans, and the ones that work with wildlife. It was a labor issue. It wasn't like a philosophical issue. And it turns into something pretty interesting. And is that a lot of different diseases came through the main breach of the domesticated animals. With an extra ingredient there, as there's money, because these things comes from the productive sector. So why I recall these three branches? Because when you are trying to implement One Health, what kind of One Health you want to implement? And the best example was just the previous question. You ask for something, and Francesca asked from her side. You say, oh, I'm going to talk about the environment, which within the tripod, the ones who knows about the One Health approach, we are trying to optimize the health of the human health, the animal health, and the environmental health. So, and he give you a right answer, yes, from her side. But if we were, for example, a physician on the table, probably the approach would be different. And that's what Connors very wisely mentioned, that it's difficult to create a narrative, but because maybe there's no single narrative. It's depending on the subject which you are focusing on, the problem that you're facing, the situation that you're facing related with health. So we need to take advantage of these three main different, at least these three main different philosophical approaches to One Health. They are not they're not exclusive of each other. So we need to generate like an integration between these three things, and this is something that is extremely important. This is the first thing. And the second thing is, whatever we do with this philosophical approach, what are the problems that you have in the implementation? And this is not new. This is even older than the Grinnellian stuff, 1906, 1920. No, in the core of every single cosmogony of indigenous people, in the case of Colombia, the African Colombians or the Afro descendants, which is a big issue right now. I don't know why is the prevention to accept that, because there's people that have been living for centuries in these places. And if you provide time to humans to negotiate and understand their environments, you will have something that we call equilibrium. An equilibrium is in my perspective, my humble perspective, is the closest synonym to health. And any imbalanced situation is undesirable situation that becomes from the imbalance. So this is something that we call the unhealthy situations. So how do you generate balance? And then from that, so you start thinking about that health is not only an issue of nature and human health and animal health and environmental health, but also the health of the economies. And then when you put all these these 4 or 5 ingredients together, so you start talking about something that we call the structural One Health. And why structural One Health is more important than the individual pieces? Because the farther you go to the origin of the problem, the more money and resources you save. So we are very reactive in the way in which we approach to health issues. Even humans, so my own life, you don't go to a doctor until you're, in my case, almost dead. I don't want to, in my case, I don't like doctors. So you don't want to do prevention things so on your own. So it's difficult. So think about an environmental issue or something that is more complex. So understanding the complexity, I think, is one of the biggest barriers. In 1964, I guess, so Dr. Harding proposed what he called the tragedy of the commons. And I think that some people here knows about the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is all about like a complex problem needs complex solutions. You have weak solutions to a deep, complex problem, so you are losing your time and resources and efforts. And this is something that I like about the One Health approach, that it is providing an opportunity to us to face complexity, to understand complexity through a strategy. And the strategy is the transdisciplinary approach. Is without leaving our disciplinary course, in the interfaces of these disciplines that you use, you will eventually, because this is a guess, eventually you will find better solutions to the problems that we already have.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Okay. Olitiana sends her apologies. She has to remain in the negotiations, but this gives us a chance to invite some questions from the audience. So please feel free to address the panelists.
Thank you very much for all your insights. I'm working on a project for regenerative ranching and agriculture, and I was wondering if you also consider the agro-ecosystems as part of this health discussion, because even here, and we're very glad that the agroecology policy was signed for Colombia in this COP. And this issue of health is also about what do we eat? Where is this food coming from? What are the processes? And this topic of health is missing in this discussion. So I was wondering if you consider the ecosystem services of appreciation, spiritual health, all of those things, wildlife and so on. How is the agroecosystems considered also in this health production? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Marcela, hiya. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the history of where the concept of health and the issue of health was brought into the language of the Convention on Biodiversity, was actually first through agriculture, because the CBD had a program of work on biodiversity for food and nutrition. That eventually linked with a different program on biocultural diversity, because it was recognized that it wasn't just biodiversity in terms of agroecosystems and agrobiodiversity that was essential for nutrition. It was also recognizing that the way that people utilize their local ecosystem resources, their local biodiversity, often had very important cultural significance and often spiritual significance. So, for example, the way biodiversity is harvested for food, the way it is processed, the way it is shared, the way it is cooked, the way it is celebrated. And often, you know, even in Ireland, where I come from, there's festivals around oyster festivals in the west coast of Ireland. There's salmon catching festivals. There's historically many countries will have these kind of traditions or around food. So that doesn't just touch on nutrition. It's about the social well-being, and it's about the mental health and spiritual and cultural well-being of communities that would be impacted if that resource is lost. So from our perspective, nutrition is a real key element. I think it was back in 2006, if you look at the decisions on agricultural biodiversity, they refer to the CBD's program of work on biodiversity for food and nutrition. And that's where it was actually a COHAB conference at the first international conference on health and biodiversity. They endorsed the report from that because it mentioned nutrition as being a key element. That has fallen a little bit out of the language of One Health, which is a shame. But that the reason, if you're familiar with the International Quadripartite Alliance for One Health, that's the UN Environment Programme, the World Health Organization, the World Organization on Animal Health, and the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, because they're adamant that nutrition needs to be considered in that, and also that whole biocultural element as well. So I hope that's some answer. I don't know if either of you want to.
Just reinforcing what Connor says, which is pretty important, is and looking at the traditional knowledge. So you guys stand on top of what was the northern portion of the Inca Empire, the Tahuantinsuyo. And they were able to handle over 12 million people. And they have food security, and they have better healthcare than the healthcare that we have right now. So I think that this integration of nature into the naturals, into the food systems and productive systems, so is a way to work. And I think agroecosystems and these kind of things are extremely important from that perspective. They persist. In Mexico, we have the ejidos, which are a particular way to do agriculture integrated within the jungle. Actually, the ejidos are little plots, plantations integrated within the ecosystem. And yesterday, I guess, or within the restoration section, so I heard the secretary of the certification convention, and he was making a point, and he said we are claiming for 30% more of the land for conservation. We have these problems of degradation of the soil and the ecosystems, and so we need to be more inventive, and we need to be more creative in the way in which we are producing, because we need to couple these two goals. You know? How we can persist with our system, with our productive systems, and also maintaining the regulatory benefits that we have from nature.
Thank you very much, Hugo. We have time for one more quick question.
So thank you very much to all the panelists. I'm happy for anyone to answer, but it's mostly addressed probably to Hugo. You bring up the tragedy of the commons. What I find interesting here, and then solutions that sort of hint at that indigenous knowledge and cosmologies could be a solution. That's a really large jump you're making there, right? So I just want to point out the world we're in right now, if we think about the generational colonization we're doing, right? Mercury, PFAS, antimicrobial resistance, and so on. That's driven by an economic system that is based on continuous growth. So I'd like to hear, what is your solution? Everyone skips around the elephant in the room. We get these little, I appreciate the indigenous cosmology and all the rest of it, but just by the sheer power inequalities that exist, how do you think of addressing that? We never talk about that, right? None of us do. We skip around it. What would you be a solution? Because the tragedy of commons implies that it's individuals. And I actually would refute that pretty strongly. It's not the individuals, it's the corporations and so on. Thank you.
Sorry, for a really quick. I think that the tragedy of the commons was solved, and actually it earns a Nobel Prize. Eleanor Ostrom. Exactly. So that's it. That's the point. And the other thing is like the three main crises we have. There are environmental crises. We are talking about that not because of the traditional knowledge. So it was the academia who points on the changes that we are facing right now. And it was a long time ago. That's why I started with Grinnell. And I could elaborate on that thing of on what are the projections that we have and how can we use so the technology that we are enjoying right now that comes from this type of economy that we have is this is the good side. But I think that we can explore this science into the advantages of
Thank you very much. And you will have time to speak to them afterwards.
Thank you very much. So it is now time for our panel on the nexus between biodiversity and climate. And so for this, yes, so this is our session on the science policy interface for biodiversity and climate change. Alexandra, can you? Okay, so I invite our panelists to join us. Thank you. And so it is a very bad time because the negotiation on the climate biodiversity link are taking place right now. So thank you so much for staying with us, for being with us despite this. And so the link between biodiversity and climate is a really hot topic during this COP. Just before the COP was launched, there was a petition that was sent by some scientific to ask for a common joint program between the biodiversity and the climate COP. So it is really a hot topic these days. And in particular, we've been talking about the link with IPBES and IPCC. And so our first speaker is Hans Otto Portner. So Hans has a PhD and habilitated in animal physiology and became a professor and head of integrative ecophysiology at the Avi Institute. And in October 2015, he was elected co-chair of IPCC Working Group 2 for the RR6. He is an elected member of the European Academy of Science, a member of the German Advisory Board on Global Change, and the Web of Science highly cited researcher. So Hans, we will start with you. And so can you please talk to us about how IPBES and IPCC findings could be translated into a national policy and legislation, and how can we reinforce taking into account biodiversity in IPCC report and vice versa?
Yeah. Thank you very much for these relevant questions. I think the system that we have is maybe not perfect, but I think it is a good basis for what we need to be doing. The situation with respect to the representation of biodiversity in IPBES or IPBES reports is, I think, very obvious. I mean, and in IPCC reports, it may not be as obvious, but I think this is more and more a question of visibility. So in our Working Group 2 report and in the synthesis report, you will find links to biodiversity, and Working Group 2 in IPCC has had a long tradition looking at the effects of climate change on ecosystems in the different realms on this planet. So terrestrial, ocean, and freshwater are all considered. The question certainly is whether there are any policy implications with respect to the use of this information. And I think that we are in Working Group 2 closest to what IPBES is doing in terms of valuing biodiversity and the functioning of biodiversity for maintaining a healthy planet, including making contributions to a healthy climate. And I think that is the important issue. I may, from the last cycle, also say that we had the first official collaboration between IPCC and IPBES in terms of preparing a workshop report with the simple topic of biodiversity and climate change. And this report was published in 2021. It led to many scientific publications in high-ranking journals, Global Change Biology, Science, Nature, and the like. And I think it's still the one. And the question is, for how long still? It's still the one official collaboration, and there is some obstacle to build on that and make an effort to update it and so forth. So we have quite a bit of information on the links between biodiversity and climate. And you wonder, at the same time, we are running out of time with respect to implementation. And I think this is our core issue. And when we look at the challenges that are there with respect to implementation, I think it's not the science that has a problem, but we have a problem with the political will. We have a problem with the implementation. And one of your questions was, how can we transfer the information from these reports into legislation, national legislation? And some nations actually do that. They are setting up climate laws, and that's the intention that all of them should do that. And the climate laws kind of mirror the emission pathways that are in the IPCC reports. But talking about my own country, they are and have done sort of just enough. And then the political debate starts, and then they are diluting the results. And then there is a short-term thinking of the policymakers with respect to elections and lobbyists and differential interests and their short-term interests, and then they are compromising in the implementation. And what is the result? We are not doing enough, and that is the current situation. So that is, but you know, making a direct link between IPCC, IPBES, and the nations is maybe not good. We have the key stakeholders for IPCC and IPBES are the conventions and not the individual nations. And in these conventions, all the efforts concerning climate change and biodiversity protection should be coordinated so that all nations operate based on a common agreement. And that's another challenge, because there are countries that would like to stick with their traditional business models like fossil fuels. So I think, in light of the short time we have, and that is where I would like to close, in light of the short time we have, there needs to be an effort to bring the conventions together and collaborate on biodiversity and climate change. It's happening on the side of the IPBES that these terms are there, and the wishful thinking is there to also link to the climate convention, and there is where the issue is a little bit more challenging because of more and tighter, possibly economic interests. So that push, I think, would be very valuable, because in 2030 we need to have saved the planet.
I like this. Thank you very much, Hans. So we can give a pause. So we all have to sign this petition that is around these days. Huh? Thank you so much. Now we will go to the cold area with Eduardo. So Eduardo, you're the Deputy Director at the Division of Environment, Climate Change and Ocean at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Chile. Your background is international law and international relations, and you're the coordinator of the international negotiation on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification, and so the national focal points for these three conventions for Chile, and a member of the compliance committee of the Kyoto Protocol. And so we'll go to the cold area with you, because you're co-chair of the ambition on the melting ice. So can you tell us a bit what is this ambition on melting ice? How do you federate science for a policy recommendation? And how do you combine climate and biodiversity laws for the preservation of this area impacted by ice melting?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank the invitation and the opportunity to share with all of you our experience in this informal group of countries that we call Ambition on Melting Ice. That is, in our view, a good example on how we can engage governments, negotiators, and the process of the climate change COPs, and scientists and scientific institutions, and how we collaborate together to put ahead an agenda of ambition. And I probably is a very particular issue that is not really well known, that is not really clear how it is related with biodiversity and with this CBD process. But I think it's a good example of how a science-based approach, especially for decision making, especially for negotiation, it has to be always promoted, because at least from our perspective, all the different positions that we take in negotiations, all the different instruments and policies that we develop to address different challenges about the environmental crisis has to be based on scientific evidence. Now, this is the key element. What is Ambition on Melting Ice? Ambition on Melting Ice is a group of informal countries that are members of the Climate Change Convention, that we are engaging in a process of collaboration to provide visibility about the strong impacts of climate change in the cryosphere regions. The cryosphere regions are basically the mid-latitude glaciers, Antarctica and Arctic. Those are the three poles that together we call cryosphere regions. And the Ambition on Melting Ice Coalition was created during COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. The countries, the members of this coalition signed a declaration that is more or less a summary of the scientific evidence about this strong impacts in different areas of the cryosphere. And then we have a strong call for ambition to keep particularly the 1.5 degrees, that is the main goal of the Paris Agreement, to unreach, to how to increase and put pressure on, especially in big emitter countries, to reduce emissions and keep that objective unreached. And the members are very diverse. Most of the members are countries that have proximity to Antarctica, Arctic, or they have glaciers. One example is Chile. Chile, we are closest country to Antarctica, and also we have huge areas of glaciers. But also the members are countries that are strongly affected by what is happening in the cryosphere. African countries, coastline countries, because what happens in cryosphere impacts in terms of the sea level rise, and those countries are strongly affected about what happened in Antarctica and Arctic. And as I said before, the idea is to provide visibility of the scientific information about particular 5 specific areas. First, what is happening in the mid-latitude glaciers. And you probably know that a few months ago was the case of the first country in the world that totally lost its glaciers, and is in our region, is Venezuela. And in the near future, many other countries could face the same situation. And the models and the science is telling us that in the near future, we will be able just to keep the glaciers that are located over 7,000 height, 7,000 meters, and mostly in the Himalayas, Andes Mountains. And this affects strongly ecosystem, affects access to water, and those are a specific consequence of climate change in that area. The other thing is Arctic. Arctic is experiencing every summer a free ice reality. The glaciers, Greenland is melting in a very accelerated way and create stress and conditions that affects the different regions and the sea level rise. The other area is what is happening in the polar oceans that are being affected by acidification and other phenomena that affects ecosystems on those areas, affects activities like fisheries. And the other area that is particularly critical and very is very alarming, the information that we get from the science, is what is happening in Antarctica, because there are areas of Antarctica that before have never been experienced melting of its glaciers or ice sheets, but especially in the east side of Antarctica now that is happening. And the scenarios of a huge collapse of ice sheets in Antarctica is really alarming, because the consequences in terms of sea level rise could be really impactful. And finally, what is happening with permafrost, because the melting of ice areas, especially in the north of Russia and many other areas, leaves those areas open for the release of carbon dioxide from permafrost. And those emissions are really impactful in terms of the models, I mean, on the trajectories, because it can add huge amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere, and the possibility to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees will be almost impossible. Finally, it's important to say that this group is always trying to update information from scientists to complement what is the IPCC telling about the reality of the climate change and the impact of climate change in many regions. 4 years ago, it was released, or 5 years ago, the special report on ocean and climate and cryosphere. That is the most complete and comprehensive report about what's happening in those areas. And we are always trying to update that information with new science that is very well based. And during this COP29 in Baku, we will release a second declaration to update the information from the previous one. And we will advocate strongly that in the new NDCs, under the Paris Agreement, they will start to address the issues about cryosphere and the preservation also of the ecosystem related with glaciers. That's more or less our experience, and I hope that something similar could happen in this process. That is this connection between science and negotiations and decision makers.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So our next speaker is Rémi Parmentier. So Rémi is the director of the Varda Group. So the Varda Group is a consultancy specialized in strategic development and advocacy. So you develop projects and campaigns in partnerships with foundation, NGO, governments, intergovernmental and corporate alliances. And so currently, Rémi, you run the Let's Be Nice to the Ocean, a project to increase ambition on next year's third UN Ocean Conference in Nice in June 2025, and also participates in the current negotiation for the UN Plastic Treaty to prevent and combat the proliferation and pollution by plastic worldwide. So in this, UNOC is coming quickly, it's in next June. So can you please tell us a bit more how you integrate the scientific messages to make recommendation, and how do you make sure that the biodiversity and climate nexus is really taken into account for this UNOC?
So thank you very much, Nathalie, and thank you to the Pavilion for the opportunity to present. Merci beaucoup, gracias. Just before I start, having listened to my friend Eduardo, as a Frenchman who grew up, born in the 1950s and grew up in the 60s, I was fascinated as a child with the expression that we were learning at school, les neiges éternelles, the eternal snow. And it really bothers me. It was fascinating, you know, when I was a kid. And now it bothers me to realize that there is no neige éternelle anymore. That's a very sad story. So first, to answer your question, as a European citizen, I like minestrone soup, of course. But I am less fond of acronym soups. So I'll refer to the third UN Ocean Conference, not to UNOC, with your permission. The third UN Ocean Conference will take place from 9 to 13 June 2025. We're getting there. but the plan is that it will be preceded by several events whose description and dates you can find in the frequently asked questions section of the Let's Be Nice to the Ocean website, letsbenice-to-the-ocean.org. I suppose that you figured out, right, why we call it Let's Be Nice to the Ocean. As I always say, it's good it's in Nice, because Let's Be Marseille to the Ocean, that would not work. That's the civil society platform, which I coordinate, pursuant to a request 2 years ago from the French and Costa Rican co-presidency of the conference to provide support for a civil society mobilization. France and Costa Rica have said repeatedly that they want the Nice Ocean Action Plan to be rooted in scientific knowledge. That, to that end, from 4 to 6 June 2025, there will be in Nice a special event called the One Ocean Science Congress, which will report to the UN Ocean Conference a few days later. We hope that this One Ocean Congress, One Ocean Science Congress, will bring new ideas based on new knowledge beyond business as usual. Scientists must not miss the opportunity to push forward innovation in ocean science fields like, for example, our partners from the Tara Ocean Foundation have demonstrated that it is possible. France's CNRS and IFREMER are organizing the One Ocean Science Congress. There is also, as I am sure you know, a proposal sponsored by France and others to launch in Nice an international panel on ocean sustainability. It's known as IPOS, so another acronym to throw in the soup. In accordance to UNGA resolution of this, which was adopted on the 2nd of July 2024, the backbone of the plenary of the UN Ocean Conference will be structured with 10 so-called ocean action panels, including one that will address exactly the topic of our panel today. It will be called Increasing Ocean-Related Scientific Cooperation, Knowledge, Capacity Building, Marine Technology, and Education to Strengthen the Science Policy Interface for Ocean Health. So, exactly what we're talking about this evening. You're asking me about the biodiversity and climate nexus in Nice. Also, we prefer to talk of the biodiversity, ocean and climate nexus. This is unavoidable because, as I always say, the ocean is the engine room of the global climate system. So it's got to be central to the UN Ocean Conference. One of the 10 plenary ocean action panels actually will have the following title: Leveraging, it's difficult to pronounce with the French accent, but anyway, you got it, Leveraging Ocean, Climate and Biodiversity Interlinkages. And the mayor of Nice, Stéphane Estrosi, will convene on 7 June 2025 a Coastal Cities Forum to address the response to sea level rise and other coastal climate change impacts in collaboration with our partners from the Ocean and Climate Platform's Cities program. The dramatic events in Valencia, Spain, this week are a reminder that this is a global concern which is affecting the entire planet and the whole of humankind, not just island developing states or polar bears. We're all on the same boat, as we've heard from, with different words, but from Hans Otto Portner. Nice Ocean Action Panels, Nice Ocean Action Plan. From a civil society perspective, we trust that action will indeed prevail, because this is what the ocean needs, and not another talk shop. There is an emerging concept called the protection principle, making ocean protection the norm rather than the exception. I invite you to check that on our website, letsbeniceToTheOcean.org, for further details. And of course, I'm available to share with you. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you, Rémi. So I think we will all meet in Nice next year. Thank you, Eduardo. Eduardo has to leave. Thank you so much. Back to Thank you so much. Okay, so now let's move on to Candido Pastor from the Conservation International. So Candido, you're the you're the manager, of the technical support of Conservation International Bolivia. You have 30 years of experience promoting ecosystem conservation and respect for indigenous rights in the Amazon. You've been responsible for multiple projects with scope and implementation around 7 Amazonian countries. Additionally, you played a direct role in the creation of protected areas, the titling of indigenous land, ecotourism initiative, capacity building with gender focus, and public policy in Bolivia.
Thank you so much. I want to clarify 2 things. First, my photo is 20 years ago or 25 years ago. And my position is Senior Director for the Amazon Program, Indigenous People and Local Communities. Sorry for, I made it my mistake, no worries. And,
Good, we correct it.
Yeah, I mean, I have a map that I want to ask to show you because it's related to your question. I don't know if it's ready, the map, but it shows us really clear how the knowledge systems are supporting the Amazon, at least in terms of the indigenous peoples. You can see here in the dark green are protected areas, and the light green are indigenous territories. All of them are titled, and it represents 25% of the Amazon basin, the Amazon biome. And it means that the traditional knowledge, it's supporting the conservation and it's supporting the climate, right? This is, the equation is really clear. In the yellow areas, you can see the areas that are not designated yet, and they're protected areas or indigenous territories. And the most probable that will happen will go red. In red, you see the areas that are deforested in the Amazon. But the fight that we have for keeping the traditional knowledge is to designate or title the yellow areas in favor or indigenous peoples. That's the importance in terms of the traditional knowledge as a conservation strategy, as a climate solution. And it means that in the indigenous world, we have a debate, right? And the debate is, we are doing indigenous science, or we are supporting our traditional knowledge systems. And for me, I'm in favor of saying that we are supporting and we are working to support the knowledge system. And it means that the governance system is under the knowledge system. That is the key thing to understand. Sometimes it's not just saying that the traditional knowledge is not automatic. Under the traditional knowledge is the governance system. That's something that, I don't know, of course you are clear on that or maybe not. And also about this knowledge system, we have to understand as well that these are in crisis. You know, that next generations are losing the knowledge to support the Amazon. And in the last fire season, I called a friend that's living in the areas that we had fires and told me that 60% of the land of the indigenous lands was burning. And it means that, and it's not worries, it will happen, it will overcome. And he told me, no, that's not the problem. We lost the school to teach the next generation. That's the problem. We are killing the knowledge system by the fires. That's the importance. And I want to just mention something that regarding that your question. This is a book with 11 indigenous authors. It is about the in the local languages like Kayesiahamai, Hauhaya, Awahobosio Bian. In Spanish or English is the guide for plants for intercultural interest for the Siona indigenous peoples. And it's in local language. And it is in Spanish. All the illustrations were worked with the people. All the knowledge we rescued together. It's a co-created program, and it's like a hot because we are launching this book together with the indigenous people today in a parallel event today. And it means that we have a space to co-create things with both approaches, traditional knowledge and Occidental science. I think this is the niche that we can cooperate with indigenous peoples, and also we work at given that the carbon is a big issue in terms of indigenous peoples, because the indigenous people see the forest, as a holistic concept, and the convention see the carbon as an issue of sequestration, the CO2. It's not just carbon, it's a value in terms of the market. For indigenous peoples, it's the holistic concept of forest. And we decided to do a study together with indigenous peoples. We interview about 45 indigenous peoples that we will publish in Nature, possible in January. It's about the perceptions about the carbon from the indigenous perspective. It means that we have to learn how they are considering, and I am saying that also that how they are, because just in the Amazon we have 500 different indigenous groups. It means that's not unified understanding what is about the conservation, what's about the nature. We are stereotyping in some manner how the indigenous people think. And that's a point that we have to understand better from the angle of the traditional science. And finally, something that's so relevant in terms of combining these two kinds of knowledge is that the indigenous lands, just the Cayapu indigenous territory that's in Brazil, has 16 million hectares. It's with low population. It's impossible to monitor in these lands with traditional ways, and that used to be used in these lands. We have to use this other system that is satellites, that's camera traps, and it means that again we are trying to connect both knowledge. In conclusion, and repeating what I am saying, it's we need both interacting, but also considering that we are not doing enough effort to recovery and to co-create this knowledge together.
Thank you very much. Okay, now everybody wants to see the book, so we can get a chance to have a look at the book afterwards. Thank you. So for our last intervention, it will be with two voices. So we welcome Marcela Munoz Escobar, senior researcher at Humboldt Center for Environmental Research, UFZ. Over 10 years of experience in international cooperation projects, especially in the International Climate Initiative in Latin America context, Colombia, Costa Rica, Peru. And you're a policy researcher from the Environmental Politics Department. And you've been focusing on transdisciplinary research and advisory for the co-design of policy instruments leading to more sustainable practices with stakeholders at different governments level. So welcome. And we have a second voice with you. So welcome, Mauricio Castro. So you're the Agriculture Director, Latin American region, the Nature Conservancy. Over 20 years of global experience in land conservation and sustainable development. And for 2 decades, you've been an integral part of Nature Conservancy. So an organization that has empowered your passion for transforming conventional agriculture and livestock into regenerative models. So welcome, thank you very much. And so I will ask the two of you to tell us a little bit more, how can biodiversity and climate goals be integrated into a project focused on the transition to generative agriculture and ranching farming?
Okay, I'll start if that's okay. So one thing that I want to say from the beginning is there's no other human activity as close, as intimate to nature like agriculture. There's no other. So it's the one activity that actually affects biodiversity or uses it. Uses a lot of water, no? Can damage soil. It's affecting climate, big contribution, about 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions. But also it's an important economic activity. It provides us food. We all eat 1, 2, 3 times a day. And it affects the health. I'm going to talk about it. Was very interesting, the first panel on health. But also people. People depend. There's over 1 billion farmers or people depending on farming and ranching in the globe. So that makes agriculture a very complex issue. And one thing that I wanted to say is that when you go to the field, when you go to work with agriculture, climate and biodiversity are not separated. It's an integrated process. They're linked together. Not only climate and biodiversity, but all other aspects, as I said, like water. One element that we have done in the last 100 years, we have simplified agriculture. No, we had, to be honest, in the 1800s, we had more complex systems. The first book on agroecology, I think, is from the late 1800s. And then the biodynamics in the initial part of the 19th and of 20th century. We have oversimplified agriculture in a way that today we use less biodiversity, less seeds. No, we use 6, 7, 8 crops. But also we have affected a lot of the issues that agriculture needs to survive. Like water, soil, biodiversity, services. So I think those things are clearly together, and the simplification. And you said I have a passion on transforming or helping transitioning conventional to regenerative. And regenerative has become this buzzword today. So I don't want to not stick to that, but let's define regenerative. I think that's important. I'm not going to go into that, but we use agroecological principles in what we do. And we have one of the things that we have done in this process, once you go to the field, it's very important to be people-centric. No, in the end, it's people who change things. Either they let your lands be restored or they transform their own production systems. But being people-centered is important. Education is a key component of that, because you learn also from farmers, but you also bring new things. But you also have to educate the general public, but also institutions. How do you apply regenerative agriculture? How do you apply better systems? How is agriculture affecting health? Because we're in this conundrum of changing, no? I was so impressed by the One Health. I mean, yeah, it is that. You're affecting people, animals, but also health of ecosystems. That together is where I think there's a lot of things that are tied together. So I recognize that this is a system that we need to change. When I say transition, we worked on one project that we call Future Landscapes. It's an IKI-funded project, so by Germany. And that project is supporting scaling the good agriculture that we have seen in Latin America in 5 countries in the Andes and Southern Cone, and over 6 landscapes. So we're using a landscape approach, big landscapes like Orinoquia here in Colombia, the Chaco and Patagonia, part of the Amazon Andes in Peru, and so forth. Those big landscapes is where we want to approach this systems change using regenerative agriculture. But what more we do is we know we have to do a lot of things together, not separated, and that's the systemic thing. So I want to, in terms of policy, I want to give the word to Marcela. That's her expertise, but I just wanted to give this initial sort of basis, and maybe she's going to talk about that. But I think a big thing for us that we're discussing these days is coherence in policy. So, Marcela.
Good evening, everyone. Very pleased to be at my home country and to talk about this nice project we're working on. As Mauricio said, we're working, and I would like to say something about this science policy interface, what we're working within the project. And one thing, just to say how is it related, for the selection of the areas we're working at the project, there was a risk analysis or climate and risk analysis to select what are the more vulnerable areas in Colombia and in the other countries we're working on. And based on this science, then we went to the areas and with people. Hearing is, I think, it's not only science policy interface, but science, society, and policy interface in this nexus. Because then, as you know, agroecology, and we're based the regenerative agriculture in the agroecology principles, agroecology is really context dependent. And the measures you have in the territory need to be adapted to the characteristics of the ecosystems, of the way people interact with the ecosystem, the culture, and the traditions as well. So we gather information with people from the territory to see what are the best and more adequate measures for ecosystem-based adaptation in these areas. And once we have these, then we go to the policy because we recognize some needs and challenges and gaps. And some of these gaps, and then we go to the policy. So we have science, society, or if you want to say it is what also Candido was saying, is the knowledge of the people, being them indigenous people, peasants, farmers, and so on, is part of science as well. It's another way of knowledge, and we have to acknowledge that this is also important. And so we go from this knowledge, and then we go to the policy saying we have these gaps, we have these needs. What we have identified, and I'm glad that Mariana is here, is that we have this gap, and this we need to permeate, to influence the training and the curriculum from technical assistants, all the people working in the agricultural sector. They are still learning the conventional way of producing. And how can we have changes in the system if we're learning still green revolution agriculture using conventional measures, and we are affecting biodiversity, we are affecting climate. So this is one of the gaps. We really need to change the way we're doing this. We really need technical assistance in a very coherent way, but not only in a top-down approach. It's this interrelation, this space of dialogue between the people in the areas and learning from them, and then building these training programs so that we really go further in this process of transitioning from conventional to regenerative agriculture. In the terms of policies, what we see in this nexus or these connections of science policies, well, we come with this identification of challenges and gaps and say, what are the, because we have really nice regulatory frameworks in the whole Latin America area, it's amazing. But we have this gap of implementation. We have this gap of capacities at the regional and the local level. And we have also what Mauricio says, where is the coherence of the policies? The ministries have like similar objectives in terms of climate adaptation, in terms of agriculture, in terms of agroforestry, but the resources are not used in an efficient way. They could like have a common objective or a common way of working. And we saw, for example, in Peru with Eve in one project, that even if they have the resources, they are just working in a parallel way, confusing farmers because they have like different narrative from different actors. And in this way, just to finish, we have been analyzing not only the policy and the instruments supporting the transitions to regenerative agriculture, but also those who are the harmful subsidies, what we have been also hearing here at the COP, and saying, how can we reorient these harmful subsidies so that the good things we're trying to do in the transitions are not contrasted by the conventional agriculture, for example. And we're not only considering policies and instruments for climate change adaptation, but of course we're also approaching biodiversity protection. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So do we have some questions for our great speakers?
Hi there. I guess this is for anybody on the panel. We heard earlier about, I think it was Hans who mentioned they need to kind of try and align the climate policy system and the COP with the biodiversity policy system, and that there's this movement on the sidelines to try and integrate them a bit better. From our perspective in COHAB, we think that health is a key element to help make that happen, because a lot of we're well aware of many of the health implications of climate change, but a lot of the potential and current impacts of climate change on health are happening as a result of ecosystem change caused by climate change. So maybe that health element is a really good key way of linking it, including issues of as we spoke about nutrition, and also oceans and health is a really important element. So I'm just wondering what whether you think that might be an opportunity, and how you might see that actually come about in terms of utilizing health to reinforce the linkages between the different policy processes.
Well, maybe I'll say something simple, which I'm sure you know, but which is worth reiterating all the time, which is that human health is really essential driver for environmental and sustainable development action. I mean, there are very few other issues that mobilize and mobilize so much civil society as a whole. We are all humans. We all want to stay healthy, and what is more, we want our children to stay healthy and our grandchildren. So One Health, as the previous panel was discussing, is something fundamental that needs to be brought forward. And as an ocean advocate, I always talk of ocean health, and ocean health is necessary, a necessary precondition to benefit from ocean wealth. Thank you.
I want to add something, and you're the expert on the health side, but I think health is an important connector for us. We are not using it, incorporating it a lot as we should. So hearing you guys was super important for us. I brought I said it in another panel, you say nutrition. It's not only nutrition, it's pollution. The third crisis, or another big crisis that is created by agriculture, is pollution. Not only sediments, but a lot of phosphates and nitrates and all that polluting rivers, but also polluting us. There's a group of doctors in Spain studying people for the last 20 years, 500 molecules that can be dangerous to us for our system, for our hormone system. Not expert in medicine again, but we brought them to talk to doctors here in Columbia, part of the Future Landscapes project. I wanted to bring that angle in, and I think that's an important connector, because the issue that's happening is we have a cocktail of things in our bodies. Maybe the individual things are not bad, but once you mix them up, they become a problem. And he's working with the EU to regulate some of them. It takes him a year to regulate one molecule. You don't have 500 years to do this. So there's a lot of advocacy to bring this to the table, publishes a lot, nobody reads it, he says, but I think that's an angle. It's human by pollution health, but also mental health. It's also affecting. So I think those things are together in adaptation. We need to adapt. And if you're not healthy in the adaptation scenario, that it will be more difficult for us and farmers to actually to get into that direction. I think this is a huge connector I would like to explore more. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, because since the beginning of the project, we were also saying the health issue is a big issue also in the way we're producing our food. And I would like to bring a sentence I heard today from another panel considering phytotherapeutic, what is medicinal plants. And someone say, the best medicine is to have healthy ecosystems. And it was like, yes, it is about looking this as a systemic way. So we have what is the way we interact with the nature, but it's also what you say about celebrating. What is the culture? It's about not only produce and then we have rice and we had corn. No, what are the traditions behind? What are the indigenous and the local knowledge behind? What are the recipes? What are the histories behind? And also, how do we interact? And when we see us as well as part of the whole nature, then it's different the way we interact. And when we say, okay, if the nature is healthy, we will be also healthy. So I think the healthy issue is a big topic. And I would just say short, also talking with the person in charge of the agroecology policy in Colombia. And we say, it's not about the INVIMA saying you're certified as agroecology. It's about how much or how many chemicals do we reduce in our diet when we produce agroecologically. And what are the costs of the health system that we have in this conventional agriculture? So I think it's a really important issue in the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Quick example about the pandemic. Let me share this because it's so interesting what happened. I don't know if you know what happened in the territories during the pandemic. The elder didn't die. Why? Because uses the bitter herb to resolve the problem. That's the key issue. I mean, just to add.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. It was a great side event, so a big round of applause.